Hello. Um, I'm going to make a couple of videos. You'll see me wearing the exact same outfit. Videos that are going to appear back to back in this course about specifically Alfred Lord Tennyson and his poem In Memoriam. I believe that you will understand if you have watched the video that I have placed on Moodle directly before this one with relative ease the poem The Charge of the Light Brigade, which is a poem that talks about a military catastrophe, a horrible bad decision where an entire brigade gets wiped out, but talks about it in heroic terms that are usually reserved for victories. And as I said in my previous video, the victory is that the gentlemen in the Light Brigade did their duty, something that the British took deeply seriously at the time. Um, but I want to talk to you about Alfred Lord Tennyson. He is not an especially fashionable poet today, but it would be impossible to overstate the respect he was held in Victorian England. He was essentially the national poet in ways that Elvis was a cultural figure in the 1950s and 60s. Tennyson is to the British of the Victorian era a representative artistic force. And he is one of those rarest of rare people who rises in nobility precisely because he is a poet. As a poet myself, I aspire to this, but don't anticipate it ever happening to me. I don't anticipate being Anne Lady Babson, although, Queen Elizabeth II, if you're listening. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm not even a British citizen. I'm an American poet. But Alfred Lord Tennyson was a very British poet, and he was part of the gentlemanly class just barely. Like a lot of poets, he didn't have much success. His family couldn't afford to live. The closest thing to any British monarch I'll start again because I just had a connection problem. I'm not sure what you saw. Alfred Lord Tennyson lived on the Isle of Wight in a relatively small cottage because he couldn't afford to have his family on the mainland. That's how poor he was. It'd be like living on Grand Isle because you can't afford a home in Baton Rouge. But the prince consort, who was Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, liked to bring his family to a more natural setting. And if you see the home they owned on the Isle of Wight, it's not quite Buckingham Palace, but you're sure not camping. I mean, they brought a whole retinue of servants. They were waited on hand and foot, but it was, for royals of the Victorian era, I suppose it was quote unquote roughing it to be on the Isle of Wight. And that's what Albert wanted, something a little more natural and away from the politics of London. And he had read Alfred Tennyson, that's how he's known as Alfred, his first book. And he decided, because one could get bored being waited on hand and foot in the Isle of Wight, when he found out that poet, Alfred Tennyson, lived not that far away, he showed up one day at the poet's house to get his book autographed. And of course, Alfred, not yet Lord Tennyson, opened the door, said, "Your Royal Highness, come on in," served him a cup of tea, talked to him about the project of poetry, took Prince Albert seriously in a way he was generally not in London. And they struck up something of a friendship. And in his next great epic poem, which was called The Idylls of the King, imagining essentially King Arthur reenacted in the person of Prince Albert, who goes on a journey to a coastal island. it became a very popular book because everyone knew he was talking about the actual royal family in some kind of veiled way. And also, one person who loved it was Her Majesty Queen Victoria, who had wanted her husband to be called a king, but Parliament wouldn't have it. He was a foreign prince. She was the monarch. He could be the prince consort. He could not be the king. And so they do not just give out lordships on the island of Great Britain as if they were crackerjack prizes, but Queen Victoria decided to give him the title Alfred Lord Tennyson, and made him essentially the spokesperson for the project of the Victorian era and the monarchy as far as she was concerned and as far as her husband was concerned. And it was, in fact, something of a coincidence of a tragic nature that Alfred Lord Tennyson lost a friend, his best friend. Imagine if, God forbid, your very best friend from high school, I mean the person who knew all your secrets and was just your wingman in every way, if he suddenly died abroad. You might feel profound grief, and you might feel it for longer than other people thought you should. And it might even, because you were that close to that person and he was like the only person who understood you, it might even make you question your faith. And Alfred Lord Tennyson writes in Memoriam to his friend who died young when he was abroad in Austria. And it's at a time when Darwin's Origin of Species is circulating, and for some British people, it requires the questioning of faith. If it used to be said, not only that God created the earth in 6 days and he rested on the seventh, something that Christians today, many of them believe, at least metaphorically, if not literally, and some believe it literally. Nevertheless, Darwin talks about evolution. And in discussing evolution, he calls that part of Genesis into question, and consequently the whole book, the whole Bible, to some degree. And people used to marvel and say, surely God exists, because how could God create an eye in something as small and as insignificant as an insect? How could God create an eye? Or without there being the genius of God? There's nothing in nature that would engender an eye. Well, Darwin's theory presents a compelling case for how eyes might come into being through a process of natural selection over a long period of time. And so if you had such a disappointment, such a stinging and horrible, incomprehensible disappointment that someone you really loved died young, and suddenly, at a time when such a book is circulating among the intellectuals of your community, you might start to question your faith. And the poem in Memoriam is about a guy who can't get over his grief. He just can't get over it. And in an era where people would mourn for years, his friends start to basically say to him politely, time to get over it, time to move on. It's been many years and you are still grieving with the sting of this pain as if it were yesterday when your friend died. And that's excessive. But he was also mourning the possibility that God might not exist, that his friend might not even be in heaven because there was no heaven. And that was very troubling to him, as it was indeed to many British people. Coincidentally, there was another person who displayed in the Victorian era extreme and excessive grief. And that was Queen Victoria herself. She had grown up in a difficult childhood with complicated issues related to her mother, who had a creepy man in her life who tried to get Victoria basically to hand over her monarchical powers to him, and she refused. And then she finally found a friend in her husband, Albert. It's not usual for this period that royal marriages are exceptionally happy, but by all accounts, including Victoria's diaries, the marriage between Albert and Victoria was very strong, very loving, very happy. It was like they could profoundly love one another unreservedly. And he died young. And she never got over it. She never got over it. She retreats into Scotland to her. She has a palace called Balmoral up in Scotland. And she goes there and she refuses to do what were her several constitutionally prescribed duties. And it's sort of a problem politically for the monarchy that she refuses to do that. She eventually publishes her diaries about nature walks in Scotland, and they're very, very popular, and people still love her. But she never gets rid of wearing black mourning clothes. And a British woman and an American woman at this time might wear mourning colors for a full decade. That's not unusual, but she continues well beyond that for the rest of her life. And she had servants lay out her husband's clothes on a bed every single day, as long as she was alive, as if he were somehow going to walk in the door and get dressed. She never got over it. There's no way to overstate how much she loved the poem In Memoriam. And In Memoriam begins with this extraordinary and overwhelming grief, and is part of the fashion, indeed, of an extraordinary mourning. Today, if you go to a funeral, the second the person is in the ground, first of all, people are not necessarily wearing black, which I must admit, as someone from New York City, in New York City, you don't wear gray to a funeral. You basically just wear black. And the fact that people will wear other colors to funerals, I find that a bit shocking, I must admit. But the idea that you would need to mourn for a decade is not generally accepted. And people want you to kind of continue with your life in a way that the Victorians understood that people might need to grieve for a longer period of time. But Victoria's mourning never ends. But Alfred Lord Tennyson's, for his friend, if we believe this to be at all autobiographical, In Memoriam, by the end, he has reconciled himself. He has reconciled himself to both to the loss of his friend and the hope of his friend being in heaven, and he has reconciled himself to God. I think that the last passages of that poem are magnificent. The ringing of the bells represents the return of his hope and the return of his vivacity in living. It's a long poem, but it's about somebody's being sort of trapped in grief. And I'm just guessing that many of you know somebody who's been trapped in grief and can't get out. And I think that it's beautifully written and evocative of that. And it's also, as I said, about doubts and ultimately a return to faith, which speaks very much about the Victorian era. It's very structured. It's about social rules as well as personal feelings. And I hope you enjoy it. Email me if you have questions about it. I'm also going to make a video now about Oscar Wilde and his work, The Importance of Being Earnest, and where he fits generally into the Victorian project. I'll catch you in the same outfit in my next video.